I think sustainable development, as it's sold to the public through groups like the UN, for example, are really not what they claim to be. It's not really sustainable development for the good of the planet and the people. A lot of it is really aimed at ensuring that people are onboarded to some type of digital control system for easier management of the masses, and particularly onboarding people onto types of surveillable, programmable digital money, whether that means a central bank digital currency or a private sector digital currency like a stable coin, for example. But all of that can be just as surveillable and programmable as CBDCs. And, once you take control of the money and can surveil all the money and program the money to only be able to be used to purchase products X, Y, and Z and not products ABC, for example, you can begin really micromanaging people.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are a set of 17 global objectives adopted in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They aim to address major global challenges such as poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental protection, education, and economic growth. Proponents say the SDGs promote a holistic approach to sustainability, integrating social, economic, and environmental dimensions to create a more equitable and sustainable future for all. However, a critical look at the goals and the ways in which they plan to achieve them exposes something extremely terrifying and diabolical. To begin with, the same financial and political entities responsible for past economic problems are now positioned as the architects of these proposed solutions. Under the guise of global initiatives such as saving the planet and promoting sustainability, these entities are advancing a model of debt imperialism, a system that encourages nations to take on perpetual debt as long as they align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Whitney Webb, an investigative journalist, has critically examined the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, suggesting they may serve interests contrary to their stated aims. Webb's analysis suggests that the SDGs may be a vehicle for establishing a system of sustainable debt slavery, where nations become indebted under the pretense of sustainable development, leading to increased control by powerful financial entities. In a recent interview, Whitney explains that the endgame for families and individuals is even more diabolical and unimaginable. Under the guise of saving the planet, the global elites have mapped out a terrifying plot to depopulate the planet. While this is terrifying in itself, the way in which they aim to achieve this global depopulation is even more terrifying and unimaginable. We will bring you clips from Webb's interview as she breaks down this global depopulation agenda and what it could mean for you and your loved ones. Please watch to the end, share and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the video.
As far as Malthusianism go, there's sort of this idea that humanity has to disappear by merging itself with machines. There's also this view that the world can't support X billion number of people. The number has to be much smaller. And I think there's been really a long-term effort to sort of engineer that idea, and it's been going on for a very long time. Like you have people like forget his first name, his last name's Ehrlich. He wrote The Population Bomb, but back in the 70s, he said, very soon, everything will collapse because of the population, and then the world population greatly surpasses that, and it didn't happen. And there's sort of been this argument that's very common with people who sort of were in the past. And since then have developed some, development plans and things like that for the United Nations that make arguments that the world's population needs to be a lot smaller than it is right now for sustainable development, quote unquote, to actually be able to happen. I think sustainable development, as it's sold to the public through groups like the UN, for example, are really not what they claim to be. It's not really sustainable development for the good of the planet and the people. A lot of it is really aimed at ensuring that people are onboarded to some type of digital control system for easier management of the masses, and particularly onboarding people onto types of surveillable, programmable digital money, whether that means a central bank digital currency or a private sector digital currency like a stable coin, for example. But all of that can be just as surveillable and programmable as CBDCs. And, once you take control of the money and can surveil all the money and program the money to only be able to be used to purchase products X, Y, and Z and not products ABC, for example, you can begin really micromanaging people and basically what type of economic activity people at any scale you want can engage in. And ultimately, if you limit, through things like carbon taxes or carbon markets and things like that, or quotas on carbon, that's essentially a tax on how much family a household uses. And so if you are greatly reducing the amount of energy that certain households can use, you're probably also limiting the size of the family that they can have or the number of children they can have, and things like that. So there is a potential for that. And as I mentioned earlier, there are people that, historically at the UN have been arguing sort of for this reduction in population. For example, Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, who was the founding president of UNESCO at the UN. He was president of the British Eugenics Society. In his opening speech as director of UNESCO, he argued that as it relates to eugenics directly, we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again. This is right in the aftermath of World War II. And you see a lot of that thinking, find its way into elite circles, including among elite figures in American politics, like Henry Kissinger, who made it U.S. policy in the 1970s that population growth in the global South, particularly Latin America, was deemed a national security threat to the United States, which is quite, astounding in and of itself. But that mentality hasn't really gone away. I think it's undergone, different iterations, and a lot of it ultimately manifests not necessarily in trying to cull people or kill them, but in some type of control over people's economic means and energy usage at the end of the day. And I think that's why a lot of these areas that, for example, in that Kissinger memorandum were flagged as national security threats, them having a large population, they've been the most subjected to the debt slavery paradigm, as in most other places in the world, which obviously is going to economically impact people's way of life and how many children they can have, among other things. So, and I think if you look at people like Bill Gates, for example, there's a lot to be said about sort of how he has been influenced by, Malthusian-ish thought in the past. And I think that's not just true of him. There's other figures as well, but there was a lot of reporting on that in the COVID era. Some of it I did as well as it relates to groups like the Wellcome Trust, for example, which is sort of like a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation style thing, but based in the UK, comes out of the fortune of the company Burroughs Wellcome that made the AZT drug that became infamous during the 1980s and AIDS, among other products. But the Wellcome Trust has an historic, very close tie to eugenics and eugenic-like thought and the idea of racial hygiene and all of this stuff that is, obviously very messed up. And they've been doing a lot of weird financing of stuff in the public health space, particularly in the global South for some time. So I think a lot of that stuff does deserve careful consideration and scrutiny. And I think that, obviously a lot of these elite figures don't see the masses as sort of being as valuable to the world as they are, and thus see them as more expendable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's plans to murder everybody. I think it's just more of an effort to sort of manipulate economic means and energy usage as a way to sort of force changes in population and changes in certain populations of particular demographics.
So, unlike the many bad Hollywood movies threatening global depopulation by murder, Whitney believes the global elites have found a less messy, more convenient method: depopulation, by basically starving us all and cutting us off certain services until we are deemed acceptable. You don't agree with the agenda. They simply stop you from being able to buy goods and access services, including life-saving services like medicine. Instead of doing the dirty jobs themselves and facing intense backlash, the global elites have decided the best way to do this is to create an alternative financial system, preferably a centrally controlled digital currency that will be easy to monitor and manipulate. They put us at the mercy and show us none until we gradually help them achieve their dastardly aims. It does not get more dystopian. Let's get back to Whitney's interview.
Yeah, well, a lot of the modern environmental movement, for example, has been developed by some of these people that overlap with groups like the UN, EP, the environmental program, like Maurice Strong, for example, who was a career oilman, very attached to the Rockefeller family, themselves an oil baron dynasty, but also one of the longest financiers of eugenics, including the Nazi eugenics program. They financed eugenics for a very long time and have tried to finance it under different names. And ultimately, they've had an outsized influence, which is kind of ironic since they are big oil, on, the environmental thought. A lot of these people, the Rockefellers, for example, have financed to a significant degree, but also other people that are sort of of like mind. And the idea of this group, for example, the Club of Rome, that is very much interrelated with groups like the World Economic Forum. Developed this paper called Limits to Growth in the early 70s that was featured at, if not the first, the second World Economic Forum annual meeting. And, basically makes this argument so that's similar to the Ehrlich's population bomb argument. But in a book they published, I think in the early 90s, they said that, we basically need to make the enemy of humanity man, like have people not like humanity itself and see them as the problem. And so what you bring up there about, decreasing sperm counts and infertility, a lot of this is due to chemical contamination, for example, among other environmental issues that are largely ignored today by the mainstream environmental movement, which focuses exclusively on carbon and not on, necessarily the carbon emissions of billionaires, but focuses on the carbon emissions of regular people, which I think is very telling. And there's it's kind of disconcerting to me that there's not really a lot of environmental movements really anymore around deforestation, ocean and riverway pollution, all the Superfund sites in the U.S. that are leaking all sort of toxic stuff into residential communities and also all over like military bases and veterans. There's no interest in any of this stuff from mainstream environmental organizations. It's all focused on carbon footprints and things like that. And the people that, created the Global Footprint, who now run this NGO called the Global Footprint Network, their board has a very extensive overlap with this previously mentioned Club of Rome group. And the Club of Rome comes out of this group called ADELA that was previously, it was really about these Western oligarchs, mainly in Europe, but also to a lesser extent the United States, sort of going into Latin America and king-making their corporate landscapes, deciding who the winners and losers in the private sector in Latin America would become, and basically sort of incubating what are now the elite classes of Latin America. Interesting. So they're not, I would argue that they're, this group for a long time hasn't really been very environmentally motivated. They've had other motivations at play. And as it relates to the World Economic Forum, I would sort of argue the same thing. They're about championing the public-private partnership, which inherently leads to, the private sector really dominating the public sector and making the public sector the enabling environment for the policy either the private sector or the oligarch, the billionaire, the Bill Gates type figure wants to implement at the end of the day. And there's actually a lot of UN documentation that refers to national governments as that, not as sovereign bodies, not as sovereign decision makers, but as enabling environments for policies made elsewhere. And I think that's how you see things like in the COVID-19 era, a lot of policies being globally implemented seemingly in lockstep. I think a lot of people sort of got a cartoonish view of what the WEF functionally is during the COVID era. It doesn't help that Klaus Schwab kind of looks like a Bond supervillain, but a lot of people, called them communists and called them, all sorts of names. And I think, you really have to focus on what they are because they admit what they are. They're about promoting this vision of public-private partnership globally, ultimately a fusion of corporate and government power. It's really very close to the Mussolini definition of fascism at the end of the day. And, they've become very intertwined with groups like the UN. The UN Secretary General at the end of the 90s, Kofi Annan, said the UN has undergone a silent revolution, he said, where now the businesses of the world, their business is now the business of the UN. We're not really the meeting of public sector governments anymore. We're, basically announcing they're run by transnational capital now. So that kind of doesn't really grok with a lot of people's public perception about the United Nations. And I think people, should kind of scrutinize these particular groups. And I think a lot of the stuff to make people hate themselves and hate regular humans sort of plays very much into the hands of the elite as it relates to class war. Knowing there's plenty of anger at elites, but there's also a lot of self-blaming for stuff that regular people don't really have any control over at the end of the day. And a lot of things that are being marketed supposedly as sustainable development really aren't sustainable at all. The idea of moving all to electric vehicles and a lot of this digital transformation necessitates an insane amount of mining that will be hugely, and already is being, hugely environmentally destructive. And you don't really hear a peep about that from environmental groups. And inherently, even if every deposit of nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth minerals, if they're all mined all over the world, it is not enough to replace the number of cars in circulation today. So inherently, the freedom of movement would be inherently limited by this paradigm. And I don't necessarily think that fossil fuels or all of that are great either. But it's interesting too that a lot of the biggest promoters of these agendas now are actually big oil. Big oil is one of the biggest lobbyists today for carbon markets and for carbon quotas and a lot of these agendas that are being marketed as sustainable development. So the corporate world is very much in agreement that this is what they want, but how does that functionally translate into, what does that actually mean for people once it's implemented? Is it going to usher in, a world that actually is more environmentally sustainable? I would argue it won't, but it will definitely make the quality of life sustainable for billionaires, but will definitely not do that for regular people.
In one of her articles about the plot to destroy financial privacy, Whitney wrote, "The WEF and its allies, including several U.S. government agencies, need a couple of things to come to the forefront of the public mind before they can offer the dystopian solutions that they have already on the books. In order to fuse banks, regulators, and the national security state to end fragmentation in the global financial system, global financial instability must first become a major global concern. With everything that has been taking place since the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, it seems we are not that far away from global financial instability becoming a top concern for the average person." Whitney asks some important questions at the end of the article. Will we sleepwalk into a world of CBDCs where intelligence agencies, central banks, and commercial banks have fused into the same Orwellian entity? Or will we fight the groups and institutions that have looted American wealth for well over a century and demand a return to the Constitution and the right to privacy, not just financially, but in all senses? Please share your thoughts on Whitney's interview in the comments section below. Also, ensure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications bell for more videos like this. Everything you do helps with the YouTube algorithm and immensely contributes to the channel's growth. Thanks for watching.